The simple fact that crystal glass, cristallo, appears in the text of the Book of Revelation dates the work to 1450 AD or later. But the implications do not end there. It also means that any claim of an earlier date for a manuscript or papyrus with the text of the Apocalypse, either by itself or as a part of the larger canon of the New Testament, is categorically false. This includes a staggering number of documents, including the most important ones, the Codices Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Ephraimi. This all but destroys the credibility of the science of paleography, which provided the basis for these false claims. Some of the minuscules are considered to have exact and hard dates based upon internal evidence such as colophons. These too have been falsified, exposing the unreliability of the chronology behind these dates. Be that as it may, the overall chronological substructure has deeper problems than the dating of the Apocalypse, as we will now demonstrate. Our current worldwide chronology is based upon one central date, the birth of Jesus Christ. His birth is the 0 point for extending our chronology into the past, called before Christ or before Common Era, and into the future, called Anno Domini or Common Era. As we have seen concerning the dating of documents, the reasoning behind many of the assigned dates have been bounded by the assumed date of the birth of Christ. But what if our current chronology is wrong on the dating of his birth? In an earlier video, we discussed the book with 7 seals given to the Lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. We learned that each of the seals represented 1,000 years of the temporal history of the world. From this information and from a statement made by Joseph Smith, we concluded in that video that we are now living at the end of the period defined by the 6th seal, and are on the cusp of the opening of the 7th seal. We also concluded that the event described by John at the opening of the 6th seal was the planetary catastrophe in the aftermath of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It was known as the great day of his wrath. These conclusions lead to an inescapable and stunning realization. Jesus Christ lived and died at the beginning of the 6th seal. Since we are living at the end of the 6th seal, there is less than 1,000 years separating our day and the birth of Jesus Christ. In spite of what the world considers an overwhelming preponderance of evidence in favor of the Nativity occurring approximately 2,000 years ago, we must squarely face John's vision and the Lord's explanation. If John and Jesus Christ are correct, then the world is wrong. If the world is correct, then John and the Savior are wrong. The implications that Jesus Christ lived less than 1,000 years ago are enormous. It changes almost every aspect of our world history and the chronology of world events. Everything we believe in our history must be reevaluated, because, as Hamlet opined to his companions, the time is out of joint. At a bare minimum, these general conclusions must be drawn. As you review the conclusions, please note that the paintings in the background present the Nativity within a medieval environment, which was a widespread iconographic tradition. Of course, John is not very specific as to the exact year or even decade or century of the Savior's crucifixion. Is there any way to be more precise? Is there an event in the life of Jesus Christ that can be dated accurately? There are two very notable events in the life of Jesus Christ that may be possible to assign to a chronology: his birth and death. The reason that these events may be independently datable is that both included celestial phenomena that affected the entire planet. This would guarantee that there would be worldwide records of the event. More importantly, it might be possible to date the events astronomically. We turn to the birth of Jesus Christ. We learn from the Gospel of Matthew that there was a new star that marked the birth of the Savior. It was this star that led the wise men to the location of the Holy Family. We know it was a new star since Herod and his astrologers were able to determine the approximate age of the child from the appearance of the star. A new star in astronomical terms is called a nova. Novas are caused by an explosion of a star, which produces an extremely bright outburst of light and sends ejecta radially outwards from the star. Over time, the brightness of the nova gradually decreases, usually over a matter of weeks, months, or years. The Star of Bethlehem must have been an unusually bright nova. In fact, we learn from the Book of Mormon that the initial brightness of the event illuminated the nighttime sky as if it were day. The account in the Book of Mormon identifies the new star, or nova, as a supernova. Supernovas, as the name suggests, are simply very powerful and bright novas. They can briefly outshine an entire galaxy, radiating as much light as the sun before fading over several weeks or months. A supernova can be visible from the Earth by the naked eye given its apparent magnitude and proximity. Currently, we know of approximately 30 supernova events. Understandably, the great majority of these have been discovered or observed during the age of telescopes. The most recent supernova visible to the naked eye was Kepler's supernova SN 1604. The designation refers to the year of the event. Prior to Kepler's supernova, there are 7 recorded supernova events. Of course, we must be careful here, since the chronological dating of the events must be considered suspect, and we cannot rule out the possibility of duplicates. To qualify for consideration as the Star of Bethlehem supernova event, the supernova must fall within a reasonable range of 1000 AD, according to our current chronology. It must also have had an apparent magnitude that would make the Earth's night seem as day. Using the scale for classifying apparent magnitude developed by Norman Pogson, the Bethlehem event would have to far exceed a -4, which is the value at which the faintest objects are observable during the day with the naked eye when the sun is high. 3 of the 7 are disqualified for an inadequate apparent magnitude. 4 are disqualified due to chronological considerations. 2 events are disqualified on both counts. This leaves us with 2 viable candidates for the Star of Bethlehem, SN 1006 and SN 1054. Both events were spectacular, with SN 1006 considered the brightest stellar event in recorded history. According to astronomers, SN 1006 is well attested in the historical record and its remnant established beyond all doubt. There certainly are historical accounts of a supernova-like star, or perhaps more than one. Unfortunately, the historical sources cited as the basis for the dating of the 1006 event and the identification of its remnant cannot be considered certain or reliable. The primary source for the dating of the supernova is a commentary on Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos attributed to Ali ibn Ridwan. In his commentary, Ridwan provided a list of the positions of the planets at the time of his first sighting. This allows astronomers, as they assume, the ability to perform retrocalculations to match the date with the position of the planets. Astronomers are sure of this date because they have used what are known as ephemerides. Originally, ephemerides were tables listing the positions of planets and other astronomical objects, such as natural satellites. Ridwan's list of planetary positions can be considered a ephemeris. Today, ephemerides are computer programs that calculate the positions of astronomical objects. These programs can be used to calculate the positions of the planets both forward into the future and backward into history. NASA's publicly available ephemeris software claims it can calculate the positions of the planets from 1600 to 2100. Of course, the software generating these ephemerides are based upon mathematical models which cannot be independently verified. As with paleography and radiocarbon dating, scientists cannot go back in time to verify that their retrocalculations of the positions of the planets are correct. Modern ephemeris software are essentially mathematical models. Like any model, these programs are based upon fundamental assumptions, and at best are only approximations. Astronomers are fully aware that there are limitations to the accuracy of ephemeris calculations. These uncertainties require NASA to make revisions to its ephemerides on a regular basis. It is these published ephemerides that drives NASA's ephemeris software. This means that when a user puts a desired date in history into NASA's ephemeris software, before and then after these changes, the results will be different. However, there are far more serious problems with modern ephemeris software than the perturbations caused by asteroids. Retrocalculating the positions of the planets backwards in time assumes that the planetary motions have always been fairly regular. It is the idea of a clockwork universe which can simply be rewound, thereby giving the positions of the planets with predictable accuracy. It is this clock-like regularity that inspired the mechanical representations of the solar system called orrery. Modern ephemeris computer software are just electronic orrery which rewind the planetary clock. But we should know that the solar system has been anything but a mechanical and predictable clock. It has been punctuated by the irregular motions of the planets and their catastrophic interactions.
The dance of the planets. So regular and predictable, one might think they've moved like this forever. What a contrast to things claimed by the first astronomers of ancient Mesopotamia and numerous cultures that followed. They watched planetary motions with a compulsive fear. Why would diligent astronomers insist that the planets were the towering gods of a prior time? Planets ruled the destiny of kings and kingdoms, and they were the agents of doomsday, the end of the world. What was it about planets that inspired such reverence and fear? The Babylonian priest-astronomer Berosus said that planets moving on different courses than today produced world catastrophe. In Greek, Roman, and Gnostic thought, this was ekperosis, a catastrophic meeting of the planets. But the memory of planetary disorder is echoed by numerous ancient sources. Plato expressed it, and so did Zoroastrian texts, the Hindu Mahabharata, Taoist teachings, and the Chinese bamboo books.
John's Apocalypse makes it clear that after the death of Jesus Christ, the planetary order dubbed the polar configuration fell apart, sending the individual planets off into space. This was doomsday, the end of the world. It took centuries to restore order in the solar system, with the planets, including Earth, finally settling into their current orbits. The catastrophe described by John occurred less than 1,000 years ago. The aftermath of planetary disorder took centuries to sort itself out. It was only in the 16th century that the solar system was stable enough to institute a calendar reform accounting for the new planetary relationships. This is known as the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582. It is not our intent at this point to analyze the Gregorian calendar reform in any depth. Suffice it to say that any attempt to retrocalculate the positions of the planets prior to the reform will be futile. Before the calendar reform, the planets were not moving in the orbits we see today. Returning to Ridwan and the supernova of 1006, we can conclude that whatever the positions of the planets recorded by the Arabic astronomer were, they could not have predated the Gregorian calendar reform. The supernova event described by Ridwan occurred centuries later and was likely a duplicate, perhaps of Tycho's nova in 1572 or Kepler's star in 1604. Another important point is that the supernova of Ridwan could not be the Star of Bethlehem. The mere fact that Ridwan records a ephemeris disqualifies the event. We know that at the time of the birth of Jesus Christ, the planets Earth, Mars, Venus, and Saturn were in polar alignment. It was only after his crucifixion that the planets left this unique configuration. The case for the dating of the 1006 supernova relies almost exclusively on Ali ibn Ridwan's commentary on a work by Claudius Ptolemy, the Tetrabiblos. Ptolemy is alleged to have lived in the 2nd century AD. Of course, this is according to the current consensual chronology, which at the very least is 1 millennium out of kilter. Using a chain of custody approach to Ptolemy's most famous works, we find that Ptolemy lived no earlier than the 9th century, and most likely centuries later. Ptolemy's geography is believed to have been written in 150 AD. However, this cannot be substantiated by chain of custody. Every manuscript copy of the geography dates from the 13th century or later. The dates of the early manuscripts are dubious. The first editions with maps were published only in the late 15th century, which are more likely closer to the time Ptolemy actually wrote the work. The Geographia contains longitudes and latitudes of locations given in degrees. This is a historical anachronism belonging to a more modern science of mapmaking. The famous Almagest of Ptolemy, his treatise on mathematics and astronomy, is said to have been written in approximately 150 AD. No originals of the Almagest survive, with the earliest translations first appearing in the 9th century. The Almagest is a compendium of astronomical theory and calculations, including the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. Given that there were no planetary motions per se before the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, approximately 1,000 years after the supposed writing of the Almagest, the dating of the work cannot possibly be assigned to the 2nd century AD. Even modern astronomers admit that Ptolemy's astronomical observations cannot be matched with a 2nd century solar system. The observations of Ptolemy are so anomalous with what retrocalculations demand they should be that one scientist, Robert Newton, called Ptolemy a fraud. He contended that Ptolemy deliberately falsified his results. The so-called problems of Ptolemy's Almagest disappear if we assume that the work is the product of late medieval observations and calculations, and that Ptolemy himself was a late medieval character. Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, the work in question with regard to the supernova of 1006, must also be considered late medieval. Like its companion work, the Almagest, the Tetrabiblos was first translated into Arabic in the 9th century. The Tetrabiblos was a text on astrology and was written after the Almagest. The point here, of course, is that if the Almagest is a late medieval work, then the Tetrabiblos, written after the Almagest, must be late medieval as well. This makes any commentary, including that of Ridwan, also late medieval. The Tetrabiblos relies on the observations of the Almagest, which, in turn, could only have been made after the Crucifixion event, and likely much later. This effectively precludes that the supernova seen by Ridwan occurred in 1006. With the disqualification of SN 1006 as a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem supernova event, that leaves us with one remaining candidate, SN 1054. SN 1054, as the designation indicates, is presumed to have occurred in the year 1054 AD. Astronomers have even assigned a specific date when the supernova was first observed, 4 July. The date was assigned based upon Chinese chronicles. As with SN 1006, the dating of these records cannot be relied upon as they are bound to the same fatally flawed consensual chronology. Therefore, we cannot reliably date the supernova using historical records. On the other hand, unlike SN 1006 and the other supernova events, there may be another way to date SN 1054. It is widely believed that the Crab Nebula is the remnant of SN 1054. This may or may not be true. What is certain is that the nebula is a remnant of a supernova. Furthermore, it is the one remnant that can be astronomically dated. Using photographs of the Crab Nebula over time, astronomers can track the movement of its filaments, measuring their speed and direction. By reversing the filamentary movement backwards in time, it becomes possible to determine both the location of the original star and an approximate time of the explosion. Virginia Trimble was the first to use this method in 1968. She published her results with the following abstract. Trimble believed that the margin of error for her calculations was plus or minus 25 years or so. This would give a range for the supernova explosion between 1115 and 1165 AD. Trimble's comment that the expansion was somewhat accelerated is based upon the belief that the 1054 date of the event is a firm one. But the astronomical calculations should be judged independently from preconceived chronological considerations. Richard Nugent used a similar technique in 1997. His calculations were in good agreement with those of Trimble. Nugent's results varied from those of Trimble by only a few years. Nugent partnered with Michael Beatenholtz to do new calculations in 2015. Their results diverged from previous measurements by approximately 4 decades. A combined range using the end extremes yields a date range for the event spanning about a century. A span of approximately 100 years for the Crab Nebula supernova event does not constitute a firm basis for fixing the event on a chronological timeline, nor are the calculations above suspicion. We certainly understand that these retrocalculations, like radiocarbon dating, cannot be independently validated. They are also based upon unverifiable assumptions, such as the constancy of the filamentary expansion. The retrocalculations of the filaments do, however, validate the Crab Nebula as the most reasonable candidate for the Star of Bethlehem event. We know that the Star of Bethlehem supernova occurred less than 1,000 years ago, and the supernova event that produced the Crab Nebula likely occurred around the same time. The other important event in the life of Jesus Christ was the Crucifixion. There are several approaches to dating this event. The first, as would be expected, is placing it within the historical context described in the Gospels. All four Gospels agree that Jesus Christ was crucified during the prefecture of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. According to our consensual chronology, Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea from AD 26 to AD 36 or 37. During his examination of Jesus, Pilate realized that Christ was a Galilean and under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Pilate therefore sent Jesus to Herod. The reign of Herod Antipas does not narrow the chronology, but it does coincide with that of Pilate's prefecture. It appears on the surface that Jesus must have been crucified within a 10-year range in the 1st century AD. But again, the governorship of Pontius Pilate and the reign of Herod Antipas are artifacts of the consensual chronology. They have been misplaced in history by over 1,000 years. There are also calendrical and astronomical approaches to determining the date of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Many scholars have used the information about the Passover and Sabbath recorded in the Gospels to determine the day, month, and year of the crucifixion. The Gospels point out that Jesus was crucified on a day of preparation for the Sabbath. It was also the time of the annual feast of the Passover. The combination of a Passover and the eve of a Sabbath is a rare occurrence. It narrows the field of candidates for the year of an event such as the crucifixion considerably. The problem with this approach is that you must know the approximate time frame to begin with. You need to know where to look. In the case of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the consensual chronology indicates that we look at the beginning of the 1st century AD. Unfortunately, the chronology is fatally flawed. Those who apply the Passover-Sabbath conjunction to our consensual chronology are looking in the wrong place. There is an astronomical approach to the dating of the crucifixion if one assumes that the unusual darkness at midday described by the Gospels is an eclipse. There are obvious problems with this approach. The Gospels record that it was the sun that was darkened, but solar eclipses cannot physically occur during Passover. Given the impossibility of a solar eclipse, some argue that it was a lunar eclipse. But this does not explain why it was dark during midday. Nor does it explain the other physical phenomena, such as the earthquake, the rending of rocks, and the rending of the temple veil in two. Yet, even if there were an eclipse, solar or lunar, scholars would still need to know where to look. In the end, these approaches do not matter. The crucifixion set in motion the planets as the polar configuration unraveled. Planetary chaos ensued, precluding any astronomical or calendrical solution to the dating of the event.